Madam Secretary, if you could have some sign these. Signature blocks right there. There. Good afternoon and welcome to the August Crop Production and WASDE briefings. My name is Joe Parsons. I serve as chair of the Agricultural Statistics Board here at WASDE. This briefing is for the Secretary of Agriculture and other policymakers at USDA to better understand the content and context of today's reports. We're very pleased to have Dr. Jewel Burdell, USDA's Deputy Secretary. We're also pleased to have Dr. Seth Meyer, USDA's Chief Economist, with us today. Welcome to both of you. Madam Secretary, Seth, I'd like to share that we have representatives from the Indiana Farm Bureau, the Indiana Corn Marketing Council, and the Indiana Soybean Alliance in attendance. And we also have the Honorable Mark Ray and the William A. Dimmer Scholars. These young folks are interning at several organizations around Washington, D.C. with a focus on natural resources and policy. We're glad to have all of you with us today. I also want to express our appreciation to Natasha Bruton of our Louisville office, Esmeralda Dixon of our Jackson, Mississippi office, and Kate Jackson of our St. Louis office. Thanks to each of them for their valuable contributions in preparing this report. I have a few notes for our live streaming audience. The crop production and WASDE reports are considered principal federal economic indicator reports. The Office of Management and Budget provides specific guidance on how these important reports are to be released. OMB statistical policy instructs policymaking officials to refrain from making public comment regarding the content of the reports within 1 hour of their release. We will not be taking questions during this briefing from the public. However, NASS and World Board staff are available for email or phone questions, and NASS will host a social media event 1 hour after the release of these data. We strive to have everything presented at this briefing match the official record. However, should there be a discrepancy between what's presented at this briefing and the published estimates, always refer to the official published estimates. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Lance Honig, Chief of the NASS Crops Branch. Lance will be immediately followed by Dr. Mark Jekinev, Chair of the Road Ag. With that, Lance.
All right, thank you, Joe, and good afternoon. Old habits die hard. I want to say good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. I do have a lot of information to share with you. You can see you've got a pretty big packet there, but I will move fairly quickly through things. I know your time is valuable. If you have any questions at the end, obviously, we'll certainly have an opportunity to do that. Before I get into the actual numbers included in the report, I just wanted to give you a quick heads up on some of the information that we used contributing to the estimates in this report. First off, a couple of operator or farmer reported surveys that we conducted. First, what we call our ag yield survey. You can see we sampled more than 15,000 producers between July 30th and August 8th, essentially asking them to report their expected yields for the various crops this season, as well as some information on harvested area in some cases. In addition to that, you've probably heard that we had a special re-interview survey that we did following the June acreage report. I'll talk a bit more about that in just a moment, but you can see the sample size there, just 762 producers. We did that in mid-July. In addition to the farmer surveys, we also have our objective yield survey for winter wheat this month. This is the survey where we send trained enumerators into selected fields, again for winter wheat this month. You can see 1,155 of those samples. We lay out 2 plots per sample. The field work there was completed July 25th through August the 1st. And then last but not least, we do also utilize some satellite-based information specifically for the corn and soybeans. You can see our focus area really is on the Corn Belt. We utilized imagery through July 27th. And we use that information to model yields to supplement the survey work that we have. This first map that I have just shows you the sample sizes for that ag yield survey by state. Of course, you can see the larger samples where the deeper colors are. And as you might expect, you can see them in the key areas where we would see more of these crops grown. If you look at the front cover of the report, you will see a gray box with a special note on it. This is actually it. But again, this really touches on the re-interview work that we did. Is essentially, if you look back to the June survey that we did preparing for the planted acreage estimates, we were behind in planting in some areas. And so what we did was we looked specifically in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota where it was most prevalent. And we actually identified all the producers who at that time told us they still had acreage left to be planted for the various crops. We went back and recontacted those producers, asked them specifically about the acres that they were still intending to plant when we first talked to them, found out what the outcome was there. And based on that information, we made some minor updates to some of the planted acreage estimates. I'll share those in just a moment. And then secondary to that, we did make a small change. In the past, we've published data area planted certified seed in the August crop production report. We're pushing that to September because the data simply were not complete in August. So we'll have better data to provide for that next month. This next slide, actually the next two slides, highlight the results of that re-interview work that we did. A lot of information here. Let me just jump real quick to what's really important here. On this slide, barley, corn, and dry edible beans are the only crops that we made planted acreage changes to on this slide. And those gray lines really show that. Very small changes. For barley, we adjusted planted area down in North Dakota, 20,000 acres, harvested down 15,000 acres. For corn, the only change was in Minnesota, both planted and harvested down 100,000 acres each. The dry edible beans, you actually see increases there, but the reason is this is actually a regular estimating period for dry edible bean planted acreage as well. So we actually analyze all states as we normally do, not just re-interview data. So a little bit different situation there. The only other two crops that we saw any changes to first were soybeans, planted and harvested area in total down 300,000 acres, 200,000 in North Dakota, 100,000 in South Dakota. And then last but not least, the durum wheat. Here you can see small adjustments there, planted area down 100,000 acres, harvested down 95,000. So again, in summary, very minor changes to just a few crops based on that work. Moving ahead to the current forecast to kind of set the stage with what's happening. We're going to start things with corn. A couple of slides very quickly, just to let you know what's happening with the crop based on information from our weekly crop progress and condition report. First, here you can see the percent of the corn crop rated good to excellent. The red line is the current season. You can see, generally speaking, conditions have been declining a bit, in particular over the last couple of weeks, but overall 61% of the crop rated good to excellent at the end of July, 62% last year. So pretty much at that point in line with where we've been. And then from a progress standpoint, here you can see the percent of the crop soaking by week. Again, slightly behind the average, but certainly well ahead of where we were back in 2000. So with that said, let's go ahead and look at the corn forecast. We've already covered the planted area, very minor changes there, planted and harvested area. Our first yield forecast of the season, 175.4 bushels per acre. That's down just 0.9% or 1.6 bushels per acre from last year's final yield. That puts our first production forecast at 14.4 billion bushels, 5% below what was produced last season. Taking a quick look at that corn yield over time and how this year compares. Here you can see the 175.4 bushel yield, a bit below trend, but still the fourth highest yield on record. Next, we'll take a look at those corn yield forecasts by state and how they compare with last year. The way this map is laid out, the top number is the current yield forecast for each state. The lower number is the percent change from last season's final yield. All the states colored in blue are increasing. Those colored in red are decreasing. Of course, the deeper the color, the larger the change. Anytime you see a pound sign next to a number, that indicates a record high yield. And here you will see those pound signs for California, Iowa, Washington, and Wisconsin, where we do expect record high yields this season. If you could see that, I would tell you about the corn production in a little bit more detail, but let me, you've got the slides in front of you, so I'm going to continue on. This graphic just highlights the corn production over the recent seasons. The 14.4 billion bushel forecast is, like the yield, the fourth highest on record. The next slide in your booklet there just provides some information on kind of how the forecast for corn production compares with those published industry expectations. The way this graphic is laid out, each of those blue dots represents an individual industry member's published expectation. The red block indicates the NASS forecast. So you can see the red block there pretty much in the middle of the blue dots. So not really a big surprise expected with the corn production forecast today. Next, we'll move on to soybeans. Again, a couple of quick charts just to give you an idea of what's happening with the soybean crop. First, the condition. Here again, the red line indicating this season's condition ratings. And like corn, you can see a bit of a steady decline so far throughout the season. But overall, 59% good to excellent this past week. That's a pretty decent rating still, even though it has come down a bit over recent weeks. Overall, you can see it looks a bit comparable to both 2021 and 2017. The next slide, again, just to show you what's happening with progress, a little bit behind this season, but not terribly far behind. You can see kind of in the middle. Of course, 2019 kind of skewing where the middle falls, but overall 61% setting pods as of this past week, really tracking pretty closely with what we saw back in 2017. Looking at the actual soybean forecast, again, we talked about the acreage changes up at the beginning of the presentation, very minor from the previous forecast that we had. Yield, we're forecasting 51.9 bushels per acre. That is a record high yield. It's up 1% or just half a bushel from last year's final yield, putting our production forecast at 4.53 billion bushels. That is also a record high. Next, we'll take a quick look at the yield and how it compares over recent seasons. Again, as I already pointed out, it's a record high, actually tied with 2016, so it is a record, but not a new record high this season. The next map I have for you just highlights those soybean yield forecasts again by state and compares them with last year. This map laid out just like the one I showed you for corn. The difference here would be there's a few more pound signs than we saw for corn. In fact, we are expecting record high soybean yields in Arkansas, Illinois, Indiana, Maryland, Ohio, and Virginia to go along with that record high U.S. yield this season. Next, taking a quick look at the production for soybeans, how it compares. I already mentioned it's record high nationally. It's also expected to be record high production in Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Maryland, Mississippi, Virginia, and Wisconsin. Next, taking a look at the published industry expectations for soybean production and how that compares. Here you can see that red block up toward the top end of the range there, so maybe just a little bit higher than most folks were expecting. Does slip just inside the range of expectations, though, today. We'll move on to cotton, continuing the trend here of crop condition and progress. Here you can see the condition for cotton, not great this season. The red line obviously down at the bottom of the graphic there. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we look at some of the numbers, but of course Texas, our largest producer there, and conditions have not been good there all throughout the season. From a progress standpoint though, you can see here actually running a bit on the early side with the percent setting bowls, but again with the dry weather and heat, that's not terribly unexpected. So looking at the first forecast for all cotton, here this is also our first forecast of harvested area for cotton. This is really where the big story is at today. You can see we're forecasting 7.13 million acres harvested this season. That is down 30.6% from what was actually harvested last year. In fact, if you take that on an acreage basis, it's down 3.1 million acres from what was harvested last season. The next chart will really highlight what's happening there. Yield, forecasting 846 pounds per acre. That's up 3.3% from last year. You abandon a lot of the poor acres, your yield tends to go up. That's what we're seeing this season. The better acres are left. So overall production there, 12.57 million bales. down 28.3% from last year due to that lower acreage this year. So the next graphic here, this really tells the tale of what's happening with the acreage. The orange line on the top is your planted area, harvested area on the bottom, and you can see planted area up pretty good. Harvested area, the big drop there. Second lowest harvested acres on record for all cotton this year. The record low was all the way back in 1868. So this is a very low harvested area this year. Looking specifically in Texas, which is what's driving this, it's a record low harvested to planted ratio and a record low upland harvested acres in Texas this season. Next, looking quickly at that cotton yield and how it compares over time, you can see it's actually the fourth consecutive season with yields below trend. However, it is still the sixth highest yield on record. But again, as I mentioned, with a lot of those acres coming out, the yields actually propped up a little higher than they otherwise would have been had they intended to still harvest those acres. Next, we'll take a look at the cotton yield forecast by state and how they compare with last year. Here again, you can see declines across most of the country. The Southeast, of course, the exception there. Behind Texas, our next largest producing state would be Georgia, and you can see they're actually looking at slightly improved yields this year. But even with all those acres coming out in Texas, you can see their yields still expected to be down from last season. Looking next at the cotton production and how it compares to recent seasons, again, you can see that relatively low level. In fact, it's the lowest total since 2009. At the national level in Texas, it's the lowest since 1986. Happy not to have to show this next graphic up on the monitor, I guess, but as you can see, this is probably the biggest surprise in the report today. At least the published expectation certainly suggested that folks were expecting a much higher production, so apparently not necessarily expecting that many acres to be abandoned this year, but nonetheless, that's where we're at. Next, move on to winter wheat. Nothing to report on condition here because the crop's 82% harvested as of the end of July. You can see on the graphic there, harvest a little bit slower than usual. Once you get to this point in the season, we should be wrapped up fairly quickly. With that in mind, no change to our acreage this month. It is our final forecast of the season for winter wheat production. We'll have final numbers at the end of next month. We're now forecasting 47.9 bushels per acre. That's down just 0.2% or 1/10 of a bushel from last month's forecast. Very little change there. And again, very little change to production from last month, but it is 6.2% last year. Looking at the yields again here, you can see the steady decline over the last several seasons, in fact, falling below trend this year, again, due to some of the dry conditions, particularly in the southern portion of the major growing area there. In fact, if you look at the next map, this map shows you the winter wheat yield forecast by state with a comparison to last month's forecast. So unlike the previous maps, this is comparing to last month's forecast, and you can see mostly light colored states here indicating not much change from what we published last month. We do see record high yields this year in Illinois and North Dakota for winter wheat. And then the next map following it does give you that comparison to the previous season. And that's really where the story's at this year. You can see to the south where those dry conditions really impacted, particularly in the plains, where so much of the winter wheat's grown. Big drops in yield this season, but as you go forward, big recovery there from really bad conditions last year. But they are still good yields up in that portion of the country. Looking at the winter wheat production over time, pretty much in line with what we've seen seasons. A couple of extra pieces of information on the winter wheat, since we do have objective yield information for that crop. First, here you can see the percent of the samples that were processed in the lab. So overall, 91% of those samples were actually processed in the lab, meaning we're able to actually harvest those plots, send them off for further analysis. It's a little behind where we were last year. We're pretty much right in line with where we were 2 seasons ago. And then the next graphic, just again, some information from the survey. Each vertical blue bar shows you the number of heads per square foot from that survey. The red dot is the yield forecast for that 10-state region. So what you can see here is we're looking at the lowest heads per square foot this season since 2018. So low population leading to lower yields this season. The next slide highlights the winter wheat production by class. Here you can see the hard red winter. Not a lot of change from last month, but down 23.1% from last year. Again, looking at the map I showed you previously, Southern Plains driving that number down with the dry conditions. Soft red winter up just 5.7% year over year. Not a major change there, but the big increase year over year to the white winter, that's primarily up in the Northwest. And again, that is primarily a recovery from very poor conditions last season. Next, taking a quick look at the industry expectations for winter wheat. Shouldn't be a big surprise here. Not much movement and not much expected from last month. Moving on to the other spring wheat. Here again, no change to the acreage from what we had previously published. Our first yield forecast, 47.8 bushels per acre, up just 0.8 of a bushel from the forecast last month, but the big recovery from last year, and you see that reflected in production as well. The next slide really shows that recovery of the yield from last year's disaster. Very clear that last year was the story, not this year when it comes to the wheat. Very quickly, the next two slides just showing you first the comparison by state of this month's forecast compared to last. You can see minor increases across most of the key states there. A little bit of a dip in South Dakota, a bit drier there than we see further north. You see the pound size in North Dakota, so we are looking at record high yields there. And then the second map with the comparison to the previous year. And as we keep talking about, big recovery from last season. You can see that as well on the next chart, highlighting the production over recent seasons. Big recovery from last year, but still below the previous 3 seasons to that. Looking at the industry expectations for other spring wheat production, that's a surprise here as well. Again, not much movement from last month expected by folks. As we look next at durum wheat, the story is pretty much the same here as we talk about with the other spring wheat. The only difference here would be we did adjust the acres again down in North Dakota slightly. But the yield up just 0.2% or a tenth of a bushel. So change there. The next graphic highlighting the yields again, just showing you the big bounce back from last year. Quickly looking at the maps, first comparing state by state with last month's forecast, you can see only some minor changes. Would point out the record high yield in California, and it is actually second highest on record in Dakota. And then, of course, the change from previous year on the second map. Recovery from last season. You can see that reflected on the production chart as well. I will skip quickly ahead to a quick look at the industry expectations for that growth. A little bit lower than most folks were expecting, but we're talking about a pretty small difference between those expectations and the forecast. Be a big surprise there. We do have a number of other crops included in the report as well. I'm going to very quickly through these. First, barley. You can see there yield actually down 9.2% from last month's forecast, but it is still 9.8% above last year. Overall, 34.1% more production this season. Dry edible beans, I talked about earlier on, we did adjust those acres up some from the previous estimate there, but we also have our first yield and production forecast of the season, and you can see overall production there up nearly 8% from last year. Looking at the hay production for this season, alfalfa hay yields down 1.9%, so overall production down just 0.3% for the alfalfa. Other hay acres are up slightly from last year, yields down 6%, so overall we're expecting 4.6% less production there compared to last year. Hops, we see the 60,000 acres for harvest this season actually down 1.5% from last year. but that just means it's the second highest acreage on record. And likewise for production, down just fractionally from last year. So it is also the second highest production on record, just behind last season. Next, move on to oats. Very, very minor change there from last month, but up 32% from last year. Peanuts, here you can see nearly 3% less acreage this year, a slight drop in the yield. So overall, we're expecting a 2.9% reduction in the peanut production this season. We do expect record high yields, though, in Alabama, Florida, South Carolina, and Virginia. So some good crops out there. Looking at rice, more than 7% drop in acreage this season, 1.1% drop in the yield. So overall, rice production expected to be down 8.2%, despite the fact that the U.S. yield will be the fourth highest on record if realized. Sorghum production down pretty sharply this season, but again, that's grown primarily in Kansas and Texas. And so based on the dry conditions there, even a dryland crop like sorghum is struggling a bit this season. Looking at the sugar crops, first sugar beets, acreage up year over year, but we are expecting a 12% drop in the yield at 29.2 tons per acre. So overall, with 33.5 million tons produced this season, that will be down 8.9% year over year. Last couple of field crops to mention, sugar cane. Here you can see harvested area down 1.7%, but an increase in yield more than offsetting that. So production of 33.7 million tons, up 2.5%. And then last but not least on the field crops, tobacco, you can see slight increase in acreage this season, but again, like many of the other crops we've talked about, yield drop more than offsetting that. So 5% less tobacco expected to be produced this year. We do have some fruit crops included in our forecast today as well. Apples, our first forecast there, 10.1 billion pounds expected to be produced. That's up 2.7% from last season. Washington accounts for about 63% of the production for that crop. Cranberries, 7.4 million barrels expected to be produced. That's up 5.2% from last year. Grapes, you can see the total there down 1.1%. Actually looking at the lowest total in bearing acres on record, but overall, again, production nearly down, expected to be down 1.1%. Looking at our first total peach forecast for this season, 584,000 tons. That's off 15.3%. California, of course, our big producer there. Lowest production since 1929. They had a couple of freeze events in February and April. Of course, Georgia, also a major producer. They had a mid-March freeze, and so they're looking at their lowest production since 2018. And then last but not least, the pears. 690,000 tons expected to be produced. That's down 1.6% from what was produced last season. The next slide just highlights some of the upcoming reports we have over the next month. You can see cattle on feed, rice stocks, cash rents, and mushrooms all coming out later this month. Ag prices, our monthly care reports, our annual citrus numbers will come out on September 7th, and then September 12th. We'll be back here to do this again with our next crop production report. The next slide, just reminding folks that at 1 o'clock this afternoon, I will be on Twitter hosting our regular monthly stat chat series, which means I'll be available to answer any questions folks might have about any of the numbers in the report. That's the last slide that I have for you. So, like I say, I'll be happy to stick around and handle any questions after Mark finishes. Now, Mark, I'm going to hand this over to you and hope it works better for you than it did for me.
Looks like something is working. All right, well, while the presentation gets caught up, I'll start. Good afternoon, Deputy Secretary. Honored to have you here today. And so I'm going to walk through the changes we made in the WASDE this month. I know your time is limited. I'm going to try to go through quick, just really hit the high points, try to hit the kind of factors that I think people who are monitoring these markets would find most notable. So, so with that,
A couple things just to draw your attention to. Obviously, this month it's an important month for us. We incorporate all this information that NASS provides, that Lance just discussed. So that goes into our domestic balance sheets. A couple other items to note in terms of global production. Russia, very favorable weather prospects supporting wheat production there. Ukraine, we focused on Ukraine this month too. Again, good weather conditions supporting corn prospects. In Europe, as you probably are aware, suffering some extreme drought, high heat conditions affecting the prospects for corn, sunflower, and many other crops. So let's start out with wheat real quick. A few things here just to draw your attention to. Production up overall this month, the healthy increase there of 8 million metric tons and up year over year as well, driven by strong increases in Australia, reflecting some, well, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but third year of good conditions in Australia. Big recovery in Canada's crop as well. As you can see, big increase year over year and an increase this month, reflecting good weather, recovery from drought. Russia, as I mentioned, very good conditions there, supporting wheat production. Offset a little bit by lower production out of the EU, reflecting, and that's just coming in from the harvest results that we're seeing and the drought that has been affecting them for some time. So real quick on Russia, main story here, just to kind of the point to drive home, weather, this is winter wheat in particular. The weather in May was very favorable. It was wet, it was cool. Things that got a little bit warm in, oops, sorry. Got a little bit warm in June, but the good conditions in May kind of helped that crop carry through. Cool most of the rest of the growing season. So very favorable conditions, showing up in a strong VHI index. That's again kind of highlighting the winter wheat areas of Russia, and also most of the spring wheat belt showing good conditions from the satellite imagery. Only small area of concern, or one of the few areas of concern, is down here in Serbia. Again, this is spring wheat, fairly dry there. The NDVI showing some less than favorable conditions there. But overall, Russia as a whole, both for winter wheat and spring wheat, conditions are good, and we are now forecasting record production by Russia. Winter wheat, of course, those results are driven by what we're seeing from harvest results, increased area and yield, and then spring wheat kind of forecasting ahead just based on those good weather conditions. So overall, production forecast up to a new record in Russia. Australia as well, very good weather conditions. This is the third year of favorable conditions that we're looking ahead to in Australia. Again, this is southern hemisphere, so down there the winter wheat is kind of approaching their critical reproduction stage. All of this to say that it's going into that reproduction stage and with very good conditions, very good weather, supporting a strong outlook for Australia production. So in terms of the wheat balance sheet, supply and use, just a few things to note here as we talk about production. That globally, that is record high production for wheat forecast for this current crop year. And the other item I draw your attention to is just trade. Trade forecast higher this month, adjusted higher from what we were showing last month. That's driven mainly by increased exports out of Russia, Canada, Australia, and I talked about the good, the larger crops there because of the good weather. U.S. as well, expecting higher exports, and of course Ukraine. And that's we've seen ships leaving Ukraine. About to date, it's mainly been corn, and but we expect that the wheat shipments to begin later in fall. So U.S. balance sheet, real quick. Back here, so again, the way this is set up, two columns, 21-22 crop year and into the current crop year, 22-23. 21-22 crop year is done, but we're still truing up the data on that. One quick thing to draw your attention to there is we increased our food use forecast, and that's based on NASS flour milling report data showing record flour milling, record wheat use for flour milling for last season. So that's the change there. Exports down a bit, just data updates based on revised data from census and others. Now for the new, for the current crop year, 2022-23, again, incorporating the production changes from NASS, which relatively speaking were fairly minor on the supply side. On the use side, forecasting higher exports, as I had mentioned before, and when talking about the global balance sheet, that's mainly higher exports of soft red winter and white wheat, which is particularly competitive right now in global markets. And ending stocks tightening up a bit, but we did, you'll note, take our season average price down by $1.25 a bushel, and that's just reflecting a relative weakness that we've seen in cash and futures prices recently. As you might know or recall, big run up in wheat prices following the invasion. Now prices are kind of back toward pre-invasion levels. So we've adjusted our price forecast accordingly. Moving into rice, not a whole lot here going on in terms of the global production. Pulled back India a bit based on some official data. It's been dry there as well, and that's an area decrease. Contrast that with Bangladesh, which is up a bit, and that's based mainly on a report from FAS Post and excessive moisture, excessive flooding in Bangladesh. So global balance sheet, carrying in a little bit tighter beginning stocks than we have been forecasting last month. That mainly reflects higher rice use in India, where the government there in their feeding program, which typically has both wheat and rice, they've been shifting more toward rice recently because of tight wheat supply conditions. So more rice use in India, tightening up beginning stocks, and also supporting total use. That total use forecast right now, which we raised again just a little bit this month, that is a new record, record strong use, and ending stocks tightening up a bit globally, and down this month and down year over year, but still relatively abundant. U.S. balance sheet. On the back year, again, just kind of truing up some data. We trimmed our long grain import forecast a bit there based on census data. At this point, we have 11 months of census data, so we had to trim our forecast just to, because we knew we probably were not going to achieve what we were expecting there, so pulled that back. New crop year, 22-23, again, incorporating the NASS production information, yield increase. So production up this month, still down year over year, but that higher production in our balance sheet mainly then accounting for the lower beginning stocks is just transferring straight down into higher ending stocks. Still stocks relatively tight. You can see down 5 million hundredweight year over year. That's down 12%. And prices very strong. Adjusted them up again this month. That $18.80 per hundredweight would be a new record, and that is driven by increases for both long grain and medium short grain rice. Let's move into corn real quick. Global corn production. I'm going to talk a little bit about the EU because that's an interesting story. Ukraine as well. The rest of the country, Serbia down a bit based on lower yields. That's also part of the EU story, which I'll talk about. And Russia up a bit, again, consistent with the higher spring wheat production that we're expecting there, favorable conditions supporting the production outlook. With the EU in general, yeah, again, it's hard to overstate the extent of the drought in the EU. Precipitation, rainfall far below normal. France, record low over the last at least 30 years of data. So drought intensified during July, and it's been extremely hot as well across the region, especially France, Spain, and many of those important agricultural production regions. And given those weather conditions, not too surprising that the vegetative health index looks very poor. And just for context, as you probably know, but reds and browns are bad, greens and blues are good. And you can see we see a lot of reds and browns in that upper left-hand chart. And then the bottom chart here, that's the difference from last year. So things are a lot worse than last year, just in terms of that dryness, the poorness of the conditions in terms of vegetation. So that is supporting the lower corn production estimate in EU, which we reduced by 8 million metric tons this month. Moving real quick into Ukraine. Obviously, there's many reasons why we're interested in Ukraine, but today we're really going to focus especially on the weather. This is just the areas of Ukraine where the green part is where most of the corn production is in the country. Just worth noting real quick that the hash marks indicate areas where there's, the most of the active conflict is occurring. Most of the corn production is not produced in areas where the most active conflict is occurring. So that is one favorable thing to keep in mind. But again, we're focused right now on the weather and kind of thinking about what the implications are for this year's production. And generally speaking, it's been wet and good rainfall, timely rainfall, not too hot, supporting very favorable vegetation health index outlook, and also showing up on the NDVI. Again, this is all satellite imagery, just suggesting lush vegetation in those areas where corn is produced, supporting an outlook, positive outlook, yield outlook for corn in Ukraine. So we did raise our production forecast for Ukraine by 5 million metric tons this month. Supply and use. Again, production we talked about down globally this month and down fairly sharply year over year. Feed use down this month. That's mainly lower feed use in the EU and the US. Again, the EU, not surprising given their reduction in production as well. Trade forecast raised 3 million tons this month. That is mostly Ukraine. We actually raised Ukraine's export forecast by 3 million tons. There's some other offsets there and other countries at play, including also increased exports out of Serbia, where they are relaxing their export restrictions, and of course lower exports out of the EU. Ending stocks down, and that's mainly lower ending stocks in the US, Serbia, and the EU. Corn domestic balance sheet, back year changes relatively minor, truing up our ethanol forecast based on more recent EIA data and NAS data on ethanol production. Also, just worth noting that so the reduced FSI from ethanol is offset a little bit by 5 million bushels by higher use for glucose and dextrose production, and that's something that we expect to carry through into the new crop year, and that is reflected in the 5 million bushel increase for the new crop year. Of course, the other major change in the new crop year is incorporating the NAS production information, lower yields, tightening up production a bit, even though we're carrying in a little bit higher beginning stocks. Total supply is down nearly 130 million bushels this month relative to last, and down more than 450 million bushels year over year. With that tighter supply, not too surprising that we expect, a little bit of a pressure on our exports, and lower exports, and lower use, and generally also lower ending stocks as well. So tighter supplies just mean tighter use. No changes to our market price forecasts for corn this month. Soybean production, global soybean production. A few things to note here. Of course, the United States, which we'll talk a bit about in a slide or two. China production up. That is mainly that reflects government data, actually the provincial level, provincial government data reported by Post at FAS. A couple other countries worth noting on here that aren't listed. Russia soybean production up as well. Again, good weather conditions, and EU soybean and other oilseed production down because of the heat and drought they've been experiencing.
We might have to pause here. I know the deputy secretary's got a drop dead time.
Yes.
No problem. Okay.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say thank you to the delegations from Indiana and our scholars. Appreciate you all being here. And I think this is intriguing. I don't have as many questions as I know Seth.
Yeah, he's going to keep us here for a while.
But I will give you the post report summary for the things that you missed. So
Okay,
you will get the word.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I?
So those are yours.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
You know what? The stuff is.
Thank you for coming today.
Thank you so much. Did a great job. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Now, I can take mine off.
All right.
Let's go.
Okay,
All right.
well, we will continue on. I think I covered world soybean news. Let's go into the global balance sheet soybeans. So wait, I think I got an extra slide in there. Okay, global balance sheet for soybeans. Just real quick on the back here, reduced our trade forecast for global balance sheets. That mainly reflects lower exports out of Brazil. Just observe pace of exports from Brazil. That is allowing us to carry in a little bit more, 1 million tons more into the new crop year than we had expected in July. So increasing supplies there. We talked about production supplies generally up globally, reflecting that higher production in the U.S. and in China in particular. Crush forecast for the new crop year up a bit. That is mainly higher crush in Brazil and Russia, lower crush in Brazil and in EU. Again, not too surprising there, reflecting their smaller crop. Trade up a bit. That's mainly the U.S. Higher exports out of the U.S. reflecting the larger crop, which we'll soon talk about. Argentina exports down a bit. And finally, ending stocks forecast higher in China and Argentina and the U.S., but down in Brazil. All right, U.S. balance sheet. A couple things to note here. Of course, the incorporating the production information from the crop production report this morning. Higher supplies, higher yield, offsetting the slightly lower acreage. So production up, total supply up. Beginning stocks were higher, mainly based on some adjustments to back year trade and trade data. And then with that higher production, we allocated it across expectations for higher exports and ending stocks and that's where we are. At season average market price, we reduced to nickel, and that just reflects those higher supplies and expectations of slightly higher stocks than we were expecting last month. Real quick on soybean oil. I know this is one that you like to track, Seth, and the main thing I'd like to point out here on the back year, 21-22 crop year, we did reduce our biofuels use forecast, and the main thing that's driving that is increasing imports of used cooking oil and yellow grease, excuse me, especially from Asia, and that of course competes with U.S. soybean oil. So again, still expected, we didn't adjust the 2022-23 balance sheet biofuel use, soybean use for biofuels in the new crop year. Still expected to increase year over year, but for the old crop year, we pulled the forecast back a bit, as you can see. All right, cotton, as Lance had mentioned earlier, big changes in cotton production this month. And really, in terms of the global changes this month, it's the U.S. that dominates. Small change in our forecast for Uzbekistan, mainly reflecting extremely hot conditions there, impacting the crop. But the big story is just the U.S. And we'll get to the next slide. But first, the global balance sheet on the old crop year. We trimmed consumption a little bit, as you can see there, 600,000 bales, and that is contributing to a little bit of an increase in beginning stocks for the new crop year. But again, the big story in the new crop year for the global balance sheet is a sharp reduction in production driven by the U.S. And then consumption down as well. So we trimmed consumption for the last year, kind of carrying that through into the new crop year as well. We're reflecting economic uncertainty, general uncertainty, trade down as well, and that's dominated by reduced imports by China, but other countries as well, just given that lower consumption that we're observing and general economic uncertainty. But generally speaking, China's buying has really stalled pretty significantly lately. So U.S. balance sheet for cotton, again, a dramatic reduction in the production forecast based on that crop production information, very high abandonment. So with that much tighter supplies, we allocated across the different use categories, pulled back domestic mill use a bit. A lot of it comes out of exports as well, and that's kind of also consistent with the lower slowdown in demand from China that we've been observing. But when you work your way all the way through that balance sheet and look at ending stocks, both in terms of the actual magnitude of ending stocks and the stocks to use ratio, that would be the lowest since 1924. So very tight situation that we're going into potentially for cotton markets right now. And so not too surprising there that we did raise the season average market price as well by 2 cents a pound. Sugar, real quick on sugar, not a whole lot going on this month. On the back year, 21-22, increased our high tier import forecast. That reflects some raw sugar that arrived in July, and we also adjusted our pace of refined sugar imports. So with that increases the volume that we're carrying in, increases beginning stocks a bit. And then we also incorporated the NAS information for beet production, and that was a fairly large increase again this month. So higher beet production forecast along with the higher beginning stocks increases total supply by about 200,000 short tons. And in our balance sheet, we didn't make any other changes on the use side for new crop year. That goes right into stocks, into ending stocks, and increases the stocks to use ratio. to 14.3%. So again, kind of well above that 13.5% policy level. Mexico sugar supplying ban, really nothing going on there. We just incorporated some final production numbers on Mexico. All right, let's quickly go into meat and dairy. So a few things to note here in terms of meat production. On the beef side, increased our beef production forecast for both 2022 and 2023. And for those in the room, of course, these are calendar year numbers. As all before, we were always talking about crop years. These, of course, are calendar years. So the increase for 2022, that primarily reflects observed slaughter data and large marketings. And we expect placements to continue high into the second half of the year. And so that will show up in the 2023 production, as well as the larger than expected cash crop that we saw from the cattle report. So that's supporting production in 2023. On the pork side, production down a bit for 2022. Didn't make any adjustments for the out year, but for the current year, again, just reflecting third quarter slaughter pace and relatively tight hog supplies. So production down a bit. Broiler production, we're forecasting up a bit, or adjusted our forecast higher for 2022, reflecting again observed pace and hatchery data, indicating some expansion going on there. And same with turkey. We're really just observing the slaughter pace there. Prices, steer prices are strong. We adjusted them higher for both 2022 and 2023. We're seeing strong packer demand, and of course, expectations, longer term expectations of tightening supplies, tighter supplies year over year. And then hogs, again, prices are strong, and that particularly reflects tight supplies as well. Packer margins there are a little bit tighter. Broiler production, broiler prices adjusted lower. Again, that's just based on observed prices. They, as you recall, they went very high for a while. Now they seem to be coming back down a bit, so we adjusted accordingly. And then turkey also observed prices for 2022 and adjusted higher in the new crop in the new calendar year, reflecting strong demand and lower production. Meat trade. So for 2022, beef exports adjusted higher this month, mainly reflecting firm demand from Asian markets, which we expect to continue into 2023. Still down year over year, but adjusted higher this month. Pork, not much to say about. Broilers, a couple things on that 2022 forecast. One, it reflects some data revisions, just data revisions that updates from census, and also the fact that current high prices, broiler meat, especially exported to more of the price sensitive markets. So we're not too surprising that with the current high prices that we're expecting some softening of demand there. And only other thing I'd note, beef import forecast for current calendar year down a bit. A couple things driving that. Mainly that's lower imports from Oceania, and also higher domestic cow slaughter. So that processing grade beef. Finishing things up here with dairy real quick. So production, production forecast we raised this month for both 2022 and 2023. Again, mainly reflecting that July 1 cattle inventory, higher cow numbers than we were expecting last month. And we also raised milk per cow a bit, but this is mainly a higher cow number story. And then in terms of product, imports and exports. Main thing to note there, especially in terms of exports, larger, higher production is going to, and lower prices, encouraging more exports in both fat basis and skim basis dairy products. But looking ahead into 2023, those lower prices, strong demand, larger production is tempered to some degree by potentially slower economic growth going into next calendar year, and of course the strong dollar, which also adds some pressure. Finally, wrapping things up here with dairy product prices, kind of adjusted across the board, almost across the board, prices lower, reflecting just lower observed prices. Butter is kind of the one exception, strong demand and relatively tight stocks, but in terms of all the other products, prices are lower. That shows up in lower class prices and lower all milk prices as well. So for the 2022 all milk price adjusted lower by almost $1, at $25.20 per hundredweight, and down also for 2023 year-over-year decline of $2.70 per hundredweight. And that is all I have in terms of the primary WASDE commodity. So happy to open it up to any questions you might have, and I know we have our folks